Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, is the Caribbean's largest island, a place of striking contrasts. Classic American cars cruise past crumbling Spanish colonial buildings, symbolizing Cuba's unique journey through history. The island pulses with music, salsa, son, and rumba, blending Spanish and African roots into a sound that's unmistakably Cuban. Cuban culture fuses diverse influences, from its cuisine to its love of baseball and boxing. The people are known for warmth, ingenuity, and pride, shaped by a long, challenging history. Cuba is a land of contradictions, world-class doctors and artists, yet everyday scarcity, ideals of equality, yet decades of one-party rule. Its story is a human drama. Revolutionaries, poets, and ordinary people navigating extraordinary times. Cuba's fate has been tied to global powers, from colonial empires to Cold War superpowers. The 1959 revolution sent shockwaves worldwide, challenging US dominance and inspiring change. Cuba's story is a lesson in power, resistance, and the quest for identity. Cuba's history is a tapestry woven from colonialism, slavery, revolution, and US influence. It begins with the Taino people, then shifts to Spanish rule and a booming sugar economy built on enslaved labor. The fight for independence produced heroes like José Martí, but true freedom remained elusive. US dominance followed, turning Cuba into a playground for business and tourism, setting the stage for revolution. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara's rebels toppled a US-backed dictator, redefining Cuba's identity. The revolution brought radical change, Soviet alignment, and decades of isolation. Achievements in literacy and healthcare stood alongside economic hardship and restricted freedoms. Today, Cuba stands at a crossroads, its past echoing in every aspect of life. This is the story of a resilient people whose spirit endures. Cuba's story begins with its earliest settlers, the Guanahatabe, who arrived by canoe and lived as coastal hunter-gatherers. Later, the Taino people arrived, bringing agriculture and forming the island's dominant culture. The Taino cultivated yucca, corn, and tobacco, transforming Cuba into a settled agricultural society. Villages were led by caciques, with artisans crafting pottery, hammocks, and religious figures called zemis. Their circular bohíos suited the tropical climate, and their society was peaceful and deeply spiritual. The Taino lived in harmony with nature, guided by the seasons and spiritual beliefs. They had no concept of private property or gold, and no knowledge of the world beyond the sea. For centuries, they thrived in a sustainable communal world. These were Cuba's true original inhabitants. Their world was about to be changed forever. The Taino saw the world as alive with spirits, with every tree and river holding divine energy. Zemis, sacred sculptures, were believed to house these spirits and guided daily life. The Behique, or medicine man, led rituals like the Cohoba ceremony, seeking visions from the spirit world. Life was communal, with everyone contributing to agriculture and village life. Slash-and-burn farming sustained them, and their diet was rich and varied. The Taino pioneered tobacco use, both spiritual and medicinal. They were peaceful, skilled navigators, and gave the world words like barbecue and hammock. Their ceremonial ball game, batu, and large canoes reflected a sophisticated culture. This was the thriving society Columbus encountered, a paradise on the brink of upheaval. On October 27, 1492, Columbus arrived in Cuba, believing he'd reached Asia. He marveled at the island's beauty and encountered welcoming Taino villagers. The Taino's generosity was misunderstood by the Spanish, who saw opportunity for conquest. Columbus claimed the island for Spain, but the Taino name, Cuba, endured. Spanish intentions soon turned to domination, bringing steel, horses, and violence. The conquest led by Diego Velázquez was swift and brutal. Resistance was crushed. But disease proved deadlier than weapons. Smallpox and measles decimated the population. In a few decades, hundreds of thousands were reduced to a few thousand. The Taino world was shattered. The arrival of the Spanish marked the end of an era. Cuba's story would never be the same. With the Taino nearly gone, Spain began forging Cuba into a colony, establishing towns like Baracoa and Havana, seeking gold but finding little. The Spanish turned to ranches and tobacco farms, forcing the surviving Taino into brutal labor. Havana's harbor soon became the Spanish Empire's gateway, a fortified hub for treasure fleets, and a target for pirates. For nearly 2 centuries, Cuba remained a relative backwater in the Spanish Empire, overshadowed by the mineral wealth of the mainland. However, in the mid-18th century, a new commodity began to transform the island's destiny: sugar. The demand for this sweet crop was exploding in Europe, and Cuban colonists saw an immense opportunity. The island's fertile soil and tropical climate were just perfectly suited for growing sugarcane. This shift marked the beginning of a profound economic and social revolution that would reshape every aspect of Cuban life. The era of the cattle rancher and small-time tobacco farmer was giving way to the age of the powerful sugar baron. The turning point came in 1762, when during the 7 Years' War, the British captured Havana. Although their occupation lasted less than a year, it had a lasting impact. The British opened up the port to free trade, flooding the island with new goods, capital, and most cruelly, thousands of enslaved Africans. When Spain regained control, it realized it could no longer keep Cuba isolated. The Spanish crown loosened its trade restrictions, encouraging the development of the sugar industry to compete with other Caribbean colonies. This ignited a sugar boom that turned Cuba into the world's leading sugar producer, a title it would hold for much of the 19th century. The landscape of Cuba was physically transformed by the rise of sugar. Vast tracts of forest were cleared to make way for immense sugarcane plantations, known as ingenios. These were not just farms, they were complex industrial enterprises centered around a mill that crushed the cane to extract its juice. Initially powered by oxen, the mills evolved to use water and then steam power, dramatically increasing production. The sweet smell of boiling cane juice filled the air, a scent that symbolized both incredible wealth for the plantation owners and unimaginable suffering for the people who performed the backbreaking labor required to produce it. This new sugar economy created a new elite, the plantocracy. This class of fabulously wealthy Spanish-born and Cuban-born planters held immense economic and political power. They built luxurious mansions in Havana and lived lives of opulent splendor, their fortunes built directly on the monoculture of sugarcane. The entire island became dependent on this single crop, its economic fate tied to the fluctuating price of sugar on the world market. Cuba was no longer just a strategic outpost. It had become the sugar bowl of the world, a factory for sweetness that operated on a brutal system of human exploitation. The sugar revolution in Cuba was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, forced to labor in brutal conditions for years on end. Life on the plantations meant endless work, violence, and little hope, yet resistance endured, from breaking tools to escaping into the wild. Despite everything, their music, religions, and spirit shaped Cuba's culture forever. By the mid-1800s, a distinct Cuban identity was growing under Spanish rule. On October 10, 1868, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes freed his enslaved workers and declared independence, the cry of Yara. This ignited the 10 Years' War, uniting Cubans of all backgrounds in a fierce struggle for freedom. Though the war ended without victory, the dream of a free Cuba endured. In the quiet years after the 10 Years' War, a new rebellion was being organized in the United States. José Martí, a brilliant poet and journalist, led this movement. From New York, he dedicated his life to Cuban independence. Martí worked to unify and fund the revolution. In 1895, Martí returned to Cuba to launch the final War of Independence. Tragically, he was killed shortly after, becoming a national hero. After José Martí's death, the War of Independence raged on with renewed ferocity under the military leadership of Generals Máximo Gómez and Antonio Mastio. The Revolutionary Army was, more successful this time, carrying the fight from the east all the way to the western provinces, threatening the heart of Spain's economic power. Spain responded with a level of brutality that honestly shocked the world. They appointed General Valeriano Weyler, who was nicknamed the Butcher, as governor. Weyler implemented this cruel policy known as reconcentration, forcing hundreds of thousands of civilians from the countryside into fortified urban camps to prevent them from aiding the rebels. The conditions in these reconcentration camps were, just horrific. Overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and severe food shortages led to mass starvation and the rapid spread of disease. It's estimated that a significant portion of Cuba's rural population, possibly hundreds of thousands of people, perished in these camps. This humanitarian crisis was sensationally reported in the American press by rival newspaper publishers William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Their yellow journalism, exaggerated events and inflamed public opinion in the United States, creating immense pressure on the US government to intervene in the conflict on the side of the Cuban rebels. The tipping point came on the night of February 15, 1898. The American battleship USS Maine, which had been sent to Havana Harbor to protect US interests, suddenly exploded and sank, killing over 260 American sailors. Though the cause of the explosion was never definitively proven, the American press immediately blamed Spain. Cries of "Remember the Maine," "To hell with Spain," swept across the United States. Bowing to public and political pressure, President William McKinley asked Congress to declare war. The Spanish-American War began, a conflict that the Cuban rebels, who had been fighting for 3 years, saw as the final step toward their guaranteed freedom. The war was swift and decisive. The powerful US Navy crushed the aging Spanish fleet, and American ground forces, with the crucial help of the Cuban rebels, quickly defeated the Spanish army on the island. By August 1898, Spain surrendered. However, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the war, no Cuban representatives were invited to the negotiations. Spain ceded control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States. The Cuban rebels had won their war against Spain, but they did not gain the immediate independence Martí had dreamed of. Instead, the Spanish flag was lowered and the American flag was raised. The island entered a new era, not of freedom, but of US military occupation. After the Spanish-American War, Cuba's hard-won independence was overshadowed by US control. The Platt Amendment, forced into Cuba's constitution in 1901, let the US intervene in Cuban affairs and claim land for bases like Guantanamo Bay. Cuba's sovereignty was compromised from the start, setting the stage for decades of unrest and resentment. In the early 20th century, Cuba became a republic shaped for American convenience. US companies dominated sugar, while most Cubans remained poor and dependent. American troops intervened repeatedly, propping up corrupt leaders who served foreign interests. Havana glittered for tourists, but for ordinary Cubans, the promise of democracy felt hollow. This deep discontent set the stage for revolution and a new vision for Cuba. Fulgencio Batista rose from the 1933 revolt of the sergeants to dominate Cuban politics, first as a progressive president, then as a dictator. In 1952, trailing in the polls, he seized power in a military coup, suspending the constitution and crushing dissent. This repression inspired a young Fidel Castro to begin his revolutionary fight, setting Cuba on the path to revolution. After the failed Moncada attack, Fidel Castro was imprisoned, but his defiant trial speech inspired the 26th of July movement. Released and exiled, Castro joined forces with Che Guevara in Mexico, training rebels for a return to Cuba. Against the odds, they toppled Batista's regime, entering Havana victorious and beginning a new era for Cuba. After victory, Fidel Castro's movement began transforming Cuba, redistributing land to peasants, launching a massive literacy campaign, and creating free healthcare. But these changes came at a cost. The old elite lost property, many fled, and political freedoms were curtailed. Cuba was rebuilt as a socialist state, with Castro as its unchallenged leader. The Cuban Revolution's radical turn put the island on a collision course with the United States, just 90 miles away. The US imposed a trade embargo, pushing Cuba toward the Soviet Union. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion solidified Castro's power and deepened Soviet ties. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, but ended with a tense agreement. For decades, Soviet support kept Cuba afloat, defining life on the island throughout the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union's collapse plunged Cuba into crisis, ending decades of support. The special period brought severe shortages, blackouts, and hardship, but Cubans showed resilience and solidarity. Tourism and small private businesses emerged, marking a shift from strict socialism. Today, Cuba stands at a crossroads, seeking a more prosperous future while preserving its revolutionary gains. Cuba's story is one of resilience, an island forged by resistance, where global powers have collided and cultures have fused. Its vibrant culture born from struggle shines through music, art, and the unbreakable spirit of its people. Despite hardship, Cuba's rhythm endures, alive, proud, and endlessly fascinating.